In 1913, Argentina was one of the 10 richest countries on earth. Richer than France, richer than Germany. Buenos Aires was called the Paris of South America. Their beef and grain fed Europe. Their economy was growing faster than America's. Immigrants flooded in from Italy, Spain, Germany, the same way they flooded into the United States, because Argentina was a land of opportunity, a country with everything: fertile land, natural resources, educated population, booming trade. The future looked limitless. Today, Argentina's inflation rate is over 200% per year. Their currency has lost 99% of its value in the last decade. They've defaulted on their national debt 5 times in the last 100 years. Their middle class has been financially destroyed repeatedly, rebuilt, and destroyed again. Millions of people who did everything right, saved money, worked hard, planned for the future, woke up multiple times in their lives to find their savings worthless overnight. This didn't happen because Argentinians are bad at economics. It didn't happen because of bad luck or external forces beyond their control. It happened because of a pattern, the same pattern, repeated 5 times. And once you see the pattern, you'll recognize it immediately, because it's happening somewhere else right now, somewhere much larger. Stay with me. Let me show you the pattern first, then we'll go through the history, because understanding the sequence is everything. It always starts the same way. A government makes promises it can't afford. Social programs, military spending, subsidies, infrastructure, popular things, things people want. To pay for them, the government borrows. At first, borrowing is easy. Interest rates are low. Investors are optimistic. The economy is growing. Debt feels manageable. Then the economy slows. Tax revenue falls. But the spending commitments remain. The gap between what the government collects and what it spends widens. So they borrow more, then they print money to cover what they can't borrow. Inflation rises. To stop inflation, they fix the exchange rate, peg the peso to the dollar, pretend the currency is stable. The peg holds for a while. Foreign investors return. Everything looks fine. Then the peg breaks. The currency collapses overnight. Savings are wiped out. The government defaults on its debt. The IMF arrives with conditions. Austerity is imposed. The economy contracts painfully. Eventually, it stabilizes. A new government comes in promising it will be different this time. And the cycle begins again, 5 times. The same loop. 5 times in 1 century. Now let's go through how it actually happened. The first collapse came in 1890. Argentina had been borrowing heavily from British banks to fund railways, infrastructure, and land development. The economy was booming. Too much money was flowing in, inflating asset prices, creating a speculative bubble. When global commodity prices fell and Argentina couldn't service its debt, the financial system collapsed. The British bank Baring Brothers, one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world, nearly went bankrupt from its Argentine exposure. Argentina defaulted. The economy contracted sharply. It took years to recover, but Argentina recovered. And here's the thing about recoveries: they create dangerous optimism. After every collapse, Argentina rebuilt. And every time it rebuilt, a new generation of politicians and citizens concluded that maybe this time things would be different. Maybe this time the country had learned. Maybe this time the institutions were stronger, the policies smarter, the global environment more favorable. They were always wrong. Fast forward to the 1940s. Juan Perón comes to power in 1946 with a vision of Argentine greatness: massive social programs, strong labor protections, nationalization of industries. The government took over railways, utilities, the central bank. Spending exploded. Perón funded it partly through Argentina's post-war commodity boom. The world needed Argentine beef and grain to rebuild after WFSU. For a few years, it worked brilliantly. Real wages rose. The working class prospered. Perón was genuinely popular. But the commodity boom ended. Argentina's industrial policy was inefficient. Nationalized companies were poorly managed, politically controlled, chronically unprofitable. The government kept spending at boom time levels despite falling revenue. The gap was covered by printing money. Inflation began rising. By the early 1950s, it was accelerating. The peso was losing value. The economy that had been the envy of South America was stumbling. Perón was overthrown in 1955. A military government took over promising fiscal discipline. But the spending commitments Perón made, the social programs, the labor protections, the state enterprises, were politically impossible to cut. Every attempt at austerity triggered strikes, protests, political instability. Argentina oscillated between military governments and civilian ones, between inflation and recession for the next 2 decades. The pattern was established: spend, borrow, print, inflate, collapse, stabilize, repeat. The most dramatic collapse before the final one came in 1989. Argentina's inflation that year hit 3,000%. 3,000% in 1 year. Prices doubled every few weeks. Store owners couldn't reprice goods fast enough. Supermarkets changed price tags daily. Employees demanded wage increases weekly. The economic chaos was so severe that President Raúl Alfonsín resigned 5 months early, unable to control the situation, handing power to his successor prematurely. It was one of the most dramatic economic failures in Latin American history. The new president, Carlos Menem, implemented a radical solution. In 1991, Argentina pegged the peso 1-to-1 with the US dollar. 1 peso equaled $1, legally guaranteed. You could walk into any Argentine bank with pesos and exchange them for dollars at exactly 1-to-1. No questions asked. It worked spectacularly. Inflation collapsed almost overnight. Foreign investment flooded back. The economy boomed through the 1990s. GDP grew 50% in a decade. Argentina was held up internationally as a model of economic reform. The IMF praised Argentina's discipline. Wall Street loved Argentine bonds. The Paris of South America was back. But the peg contained a fatal flaw that everyone could see but nobody wanted to address. A fixed exchange rate only works if your economy stays competitive relative to the currency you're pegged to. Through the 1990s, the dollar strengthened significantly against other currencies, which meant the peso strengthened too. Argentine exports became expensive relative to competitors. Brazilian goods were cheaper, Chilean goods were cheaper, Argentine factories couldn't compete, trade deficits grew, and the Argentine government was still spending beyond its means. The peg meant they couldn't print money to cover deficits. That would break the 1-to-1 ratio. So they borrowed in dollars instead. Government debt in dollars grew rapidly, which created a catastrophic risk. If the peg ever broke, those dollar debts would become unpayable in devalued pesos. The entire country would be instantly insolvent. Everyone in finance understood this. The IMF understood this. Argentine economists understood this. But the peg was politically sacred. It had ended the hyperinflation nightmare. No politician wanted to be responsible for ending it. Then, in 1998, Brazil, Argentina's largest trading partner, devalued its currency. Suddenly, Brazilian goods were dramatically cheaper than Argentine goods. Argentine industry was crushed. The economy went into recession. Tax revenues fell. The government borrowed more to cover the deficit. Debt spiraled. Interest rates rose as investors grew nervous. Higher interest rates slowed the economy further. Less tax revenue, more borrowing. The spiral accelerated. By 2001, it was over. Argentina couldn't service its dollar debts. The government tried to stop bank runs by freezing bank accounts, the infamous corralito, limiting Argentines to withdrawing only $250 per week from their own money. The middle class that had saved in dollars, that had done everything right, that had trusted the system, found their savings locked in banks they couldn't access. The streets exploded. Protests, riots. The government declared a state of siege. The response was more protests. In December 2001, 5 presidents resigned in 11 days. Argentina defaulted on $100 billion in debt, the largest sovereign default in history at the time. The peso was devalued. Within weeks, 1 peso was worth 25 cents instead of $1. Everyone with peso savings lost 75% of their wealth overnight. Everyone with dollar savings locked in banks watched as their accounts were converted to pesos at the unfavorable rate. The middle class was financially devastated. Again, the recovery came. It always comes. Argentina restructured its debt, grew through a commodity boom in the 2000s, and stabilized. A new generation grew up in relative prosperity. And then the pattern started again. Governments in the 2010s increased spending dramatically. Subsidies for energy, transport, food, popular programs that cost billions. When commodity prices fell again, the revenue wasn't there. Deficits grew. The central bank printed pesos to cover them. Inflation rose. To hide it, the government manipulated official statistics, literally publishing false inflation numbers for years. The reality was far worse than the official data admitted. By 2018, another crisis. Emergency IMF loan, $57 billion, the largest in IMF history. Austerity conditions, political turmoil. By 2023, inflation crossed 200% annually. The peso was losing value so fast that Argentines were converting savings to dollars, to crypto, to anything other than their own currency the moment they received income. A country that had been through this 5 times was going through it again, and the mechanism was identical every single time. Now here's the question that should be keeping you up at night. If Argentina could see the pattern, if their economists, their politicians, their citizens had lived through versions of this collapse multiple times, why couldn't they stop it? The answer is the same every time. Because stopping it requires short-term pain that no politician can survive electorally. Cutting popular spending programs, raising taxes, accepting recession deliberately to prevent a worse crisis later. Every Argentine politician who tried to impose genuine fiscal discipline was voted out, overthrown, or forced to resign. Every politician who promised spending and growth won elections. The voters chose short-term comfort over long-term stability, every time. Not because they were stupid, because that's what humans do when the pain is immediate and the consequences are abstract. And here's where America enters the picture, because America is not Argentina. America has the global reserve currency, which gives enormous protection Argentina never had. America's institutions are stronger, its economy more diversified, its financial system more sophisticated. But the mechanism is identical, a government making spending commitments it can't fund through taxation, borrowing to cover the gap, printing money when borrowing becomes expensive. $36 trillion in debt, growing at 8% annually, while the economy grows at 2 to 3%. Interest payments crossing $1 trillion per year. Politicians on both sides unwilling to cut spending or raise taxes enough to matter because the electoral consequences are fatal. Argentina proves that having done it before doesn't prevent you from doing it again. That knowing the pattern intellectually doesn't create the political will to break it. That each cycle feels different from the inside. Different leaders, different justifications, different external circumstances, even when the underlying mechanism is exactly the same. The question for America isn't whether the mechanism is operating. The numbers confirm it is. The question is, how many cycles are left before the reserve currency privilege that has protected America runs out? Argentina had commodity booms that bought time. Argentina had IMF loans that bought time. Each rescue bought another cycle before the pattern repeated. America's version of the IMF loan is the dollar's reserve currency status, the ability to borrow at low rates because the world needs dollars. But Argentina's creditors eventually stopped believing. They demanded higher rates. Then they stopped lending entirely. The moment that happened, the cycle ended badly. What happens when the world's creditors start demanding higher rates from America? What happens when dollar alternatives become viable enough that reserve currency status starts to erode? Argentina shows us exactly what happens next. The same thing that always happens. The same thing that has always happened. The pattern doesn't care how large you are, it only cares whether the math works. And when the math stops working, the collapse doesn't announce itself. It arrives the same way Hemingway described bankruptcy. Gradually, then all at once. If you've made it this far, you're watching history with open eyes. Subscribe because I'm tracking the exact financial patterns that repeat across centuries and continents. Hit that like button if Argentina just changed how you see America's debt trajectory. And drop a comment. Do you think America's reserve currency status actually breaks the pattern? Or does it just make the eventual reckoning larger? Because Argentina thought each recovery meant the cycle was over too. 5 times. The pattern doesn't break just because you've survived it before. It breaks when you finally make the hard choices. And right now, nobody's making them.